first of all, DQ gave a session on what's new in ACTS. ACTS is an automated testing tool, and basically the new things, features that are available in ACTS is that it supports the latest web content and accessibility guidelines, or 2.1, and it also supports shadow DOM, so things that weren't able to be tested previously in the ACTS rules engine now can be. Also, there was some collaboration between Microsoft and DQ, so that Windows now have something called Accessibility Insights. So basically you can now test the accessibility of your Windows app in Windows. And this is an amazing collaboration between DQ and Microsoft that makes this possible. And then another area, another feature that they've released is a native mobile Android and iOS app analyzer. So anybody who tries to test native mobile accessibility, you'll realize the difficulties, because unless you've got access to the code, it's usually quite difficult to analyze accessibility. So this tool enables some automated testing to check accessibility of these native apps. So ACTS for native mobile is basically an application, and I have used this in my work, that can test and analyze native and hybrid applications. It's based on WCAG standards, but also Android best practices. And I think the iOS version is due to be released anytime now. I don't think it's been released yet. But again, that's another app that you're going to be able to test the accessibility of your iOS native apps. How is it different to what's available currently? Because there are some automated testing tools out there currently that will check certain accessibility aspects of a native app. So basically on the screen here we have testing criteria that's unique to apps, and different things that you can test that are available out there anyway. So things like active view name, color contrast, image view name, custom and WCAG touch size, these can be tested already. But the difference with ACTS is that it tests a whole lot more, such as checkbox name, the accessibility focus on your apps, edit text name, edit text value, and switch name. So it's the most comprehensive automated analysis tool currently out there for native mobile. So that was something that I was really excited about, that you can check native mobile now in an automated way. Another exciting feature from this, again, was from DQ, was design heuristics. So a lot of designers, in terms of WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, a lot of WCAG doesn't really apply to design and to designers, and often it's really tedious to work through WCAG documentation when not all of it applies to you. So this is where DQ have tried to fill this gap. So they've released these heuristics, which are inspired by WCAG, and it's basically 10 general rules of thumb to integrate accessibility directly into the design process. So kind of that shift left, trying to basically bring accessibility upstream, earlier in the development cycle, and it just makes addressing accessibility a lot easier for those in the role of design. Here is an example of one of the heuristics. So this is the navigation and wayfinding, and then they have these like little checks of what designers can refer to based on WCAG, and it's just a very easy way of checking whether your designs are compliant and accessible. So for example, the first one there says, is there a clear visible indicator set on all active elements as they receive focus? So that's just one example of some of the features that DQ have released to address the needs for designers in terms of accessibility. There were a number of sessions around anxiety and designing for users with anxiety. And this is quite relevant to us here in New Zealand, because according to the Anxiety New Zealand Trust, around 1 in 4 of us experience some kind of anxiety or depression or panic attacks, PTSD. That's quite a large percentage. And so there were around 3 sessions at CSUN that was addressing users with anxiety. And they discussed the different spectrum of anxiety disorders. They also discussed the WCAG 2.1 criteria that's specific to assisting people with anxiety. And then just simple design solutions, really, that can help mitigate some of that anxiety that some of your users may experience when they're accessing your products. So an example here, this is from booking.com. I'm not trying to, hate booking.com, but any booking app, basically you'll see this, this kind of scenario. So you notice on the bottom left there, in high demand, in red, exclamation mark. Things like this can actually induce anxiety in some users. Another example here, only 3 rooms left, book now or you'll miss out forever. So on the bottom left there in red and exclamation mark. There were lots of other examples that were presented that kind of was a real eye-opener for people, like the kind of experiences that some users may have when accessing certain digital content, and even just the textual information that you present can make such an impact. So in terms of WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that relate to anxiety, it's quite surprising how many there really are. This is just a section of the list. So things like providing clear instructions. It sounds quite a very basic, simple criterion, but if your instructions are clear, the amount of anxieties that your users will have is going to be greatly reduced. Another example is to clarify jargon and abbreviations. Not everybody understands the abbreviations that may be on your content, and this is something that we do see a lot in Access Advisors when we analyse organisations' content. Announcing how much time a user will have rather than just kicking them out. If there's timeouts, then you should really give that information beforehand. Keeping navigation controls consistent. So consistency reduces anxiety greatly because you're expecting the same thing to happen, and it's kind of reassuring for users with anxiety. Just going through that list there, you can see how applying those that criteria to your products can really, really help reduce any symptoms of anxiety for your users. So that was something that I found really, really useful for myself. And there's lots of resources out there that can help. So the UK Home Office, they produce lots of do's and don'ts posters. And one of the latest ones is in regard to designing for users with anxiety. So please feel free to check out their site and download their posters and decorate your desks and offices with them, just as a reminder. And also the Paciello group, they published the Inclusive Design Principles, which can also help and also address this area of anxiety. Okay, probably one of the most exciting sessions I went to was one called The State of Web Accessibility. So this was research done by leading accessibility organisation WebAIM. And basically they tested the top 1 million homepages in the world. And the insights that they gained from that were quite interesting. So I'm going to just run through some of the main insights with you, but please feel free to check out that research yourself, because I'm sure you'll find it very interesting. And another thing that you can do is check whether your homepage is included in that research. So there's a little input box where you can put in your homepage and check how you fared. No pressure. Okay, so some of the main insights were that each homepage averaged 59.6 detectable errors. That's quite a lot. 7.6 of all homepage elements have a detectable accessibility error. And this one was quite depressing. The WCAG failure rate for homepages was at least 97.8%. So when it says the state of web accessibility, it does seem to infer that it's in a state. However, most common failures, and this is kind of representative of what we find at Access Advisors and the research that was done by the Web Government Standards. So in self-assessing the government websites. So it's very representative. It's the same kind of issues that we experience. So the most common issue, accessibility issue, over 75% was low contrast. The next, around 60%, was missing alternative text for non-text content such as images and graphics. Empty links, so we often see these on web pages. So links with no discernible text at all. So somebody who's non-sighted accesses the link and there's no information at all. Missing form labels. So have you ever tried to enter data into a form and you don't know what the label's for? It doesn't often happen for sighted users, but for non-sighted users, if there's no accessible name or label for that form, then you basically can't fill out the form without help. Missing document language, so the actual default language of the document's missing. That was another common failure at around 30%. And then empty buttons. So accessing a button, the button has no name, no accessible name. So somebody reliant on that code to tell them the purpose of that button wouldn't be able to use it, basically. So these were the top common failures. And there were some really other interesting insights around technologies that are used now on the web. Pages with ARIA averaged 11.2 more detectable errors than pages without ARIA. Now that seems to indicate that, does ARIA make pages inaccessible? That's a question that you could ask. Or is it that the ARIA that is implemented on the pages is badly done or incorrectly done? Because there's a lot of confusion and a lack of understanding around correct use of ARIA. So that was an interesting insight. Other insights were around common technologies used in the web, such as content management systems like WordPress and Joomla, etc. JavaScript libraries and frameworks, and web frameworks, and how these actually impact on accessibility. So there's a whole list of these frameworks and common technologies, and an analysis of where they were present, whether it increased or decreased accessibility. And some of those insights were really interesting. So I recommend that you check out WebAIM's research for yourself, just to see, how you're faring and which technologies, if you are incorporating into your sites, is having an impact on accessibility. Yeah, and the last one was from Google. So Rob Dodson from Google actually demonstrated how now in the Chrome DevTools for testing accessibility and actually using those DevTools to analyze content can actually be done now with a screen reader. So that means that users who are reliant on a screen reader, sighted or non-sighted, can actually use these development tools just as you or I could. So those were my top insights and highlights from CSUN. I could have go on and on and on and on, but I have 15 minutes, so that's probably my time up. So does anybody have any questions? Yes?
You talked about the area label and the problems of it. And so I work at training, and one of the things that we have done was adding area labels to the components.
Yep.
And my question was, and when we test this with VoiceOver, it seems to work well, but when we test it with NVDA, it doesn't. NVDA doesn't respect area label. So my question is, would you recommend us changing this to a visually hidden text?
Okay, so the first rule of ARIA is not to use it. The second rule is never to override HTML element with ARIA. So we always advise that people if they are going to use ARIA, which is just there to supplement HTML, it's not a replacement for, always look to the W3C Why authoring practices. That should be your Bible, because ARIA is often misapplied and it's placed on elements that shouldn't really have ARIA on it. So the W3C, the documentation that they produced is, I think it's very clear on where you should be placing ARIA, when you should be using it, when you shouldn't. So that would be my recommendation. Always go to the W3C authoring practices. Okay, so I'll pass back to Phil.
Thanks. I might move this out. Just Zoe was the one with the presentation, so I'm just going to move it back out so people can move in and out from behind the lectern if they choose. Look, thank you very much. The next speaker that we have is Toby. I won't even try the last name. I'm not sure I get it quite right. Toby is Head of Digital Experience at ASB Bank. And we've been doing a little bit of work with them lately, and we've seen some great movement in that space and their real, shall we say, drive to get this right. And so I asked Toby along just to talk about why they've got that drive, what's going on there, and a few other things as well.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm aware in talking to you that we're probably not currently the greatest example of web accessibility in the whole world. And that is something that we take as a challenge and something that we're working on. So when Phil asked me to talk to you today, while I felt like a bit of a pariah initially, I also I wanted to come and share with you why we have recently taken the opportunity to refresh our approach to accessibility and specifically what we're doing about it, in part in the hope that we might be able to inspire some other organisations to also step up their game. ASB is a purpose-led organisation. And speaking to our corporate comms team before I came down here, it became apparent that we don't speak about our purpose publicly very often, so you might be hearing something that not too many people outside of ASB have ever heard. But our purpose is to accelerate the financial progress of all New Zealanders. And I'm personally, I think a lot of people at ASB are easily aligned to that. If you break that down in a few different ways, financial progress means different things to different people, and it's really important for us to understand, where those people are at, and what helping accelerate financial progress looks like for them. It's also for all New Zealanders. So it's not just about our customers. We don't just sort of say, well, if you don't bank with us, it's tough. And our community outreach programs with things like St John's and in school, with financial literacy programs and those sorts of things, do allow us to participate in the community in a global way within New Zealand. And we're very aware when we do that and even within our customer base, because of the wide reach we have, I think, in totality, something like 1.4 million customers, that we are going to be touching an incredibly diverse array of people in virtually every dimension of diversity. So we do want to try and be as inclusive as we can for those people. So, I wanted to talk about various drivers around accessibility for us. Some of them are intrinsic, some of them are extrinsic. One of the extrinsic drivers is the New Zealand Bankers Association guidelines. So we, as holding a bank license in New Zealand, are a member of the New Zealand Bankers Association, and the New Zealand Bankers Association has recently done some work to revise its guidelines for older and disabled customers. And those new guidelines came into effect in the 1st of April. We ratified those guidelines, and I just thought I'd quote briefly from them. When developing electronic banking services, we'll consider using international W3C web accessibility best practice, the accessibility related New Zealand e-government web standards, and recommendations. And so I guess that's nice. Consider is nice. It's a good step forward from where the wording of that particular guideline used to be. But I think that it's, we think at ASB that it's more courageous to attempt to comply with standards rather than just to consider those standards. So we're going to have a fair crack at that, and we'll see how we get on. We're acutely aware also, and I think it covers it in the introduction of that particular guideline, that there's an increasing proportion of the New Zealand population who are older, and the disabled community, and we really do want to acknowledge those people and make sure that we are providing services for them that are appropriate. We're also aware of the New Zealand government web standards. Maybe Jason will speak more to that, and I don't want to take that away from him. But they are coming in July, and we've been following that closely. We have several people in the office that are strong advocates for web accessibility, so we're impressed by that. We like that. Congratulations on that. These internal and external factors, and obviously the timing of this all in the start or towards the middle of this year, it really did lead us down the path of taking a moment to step back and strongly consider, what our commitment was to accessibility. And we decided that we really wanted to up our game. And upping our game takes a lot of different dimensions, and I'll run through them briefly without boring you to tears. Some of them are pretty obvious, but the first one was we wanted to consider what standards we would adopt. Previously, and just to put some colour on it, ASB's been internet banking for 22 years. I think our CEO, when we were the first bank to offer internet banking in 1997, was on the 6 o'clock news doing a live transfer between two of his accounts in about 1997. That was pretty important. It means that we've also got some really old stuff. So, we've also been doing mobile app native banking since 2012. And again, that's 7 years ago now. So that's quite a long time. and we're just in the process of rolling out the first sort of really big set of changes to that at the moment. We have internet banking for personal customers, mobile apps for personal customers. We have internet banking for businesses. We have mobile apps for businesses. We have a large public website. We have online share trading. You're kind of getting the idea. We have quite a wide footprint, even for the size of our organisation. And I think that the challenge for us is not only to do this for what most people use most of the time, but to do it consistently. So that's one of those things that we take on. We have 20, or I'm going to lose count. We have over 20 cross-functional development teams that are currently working at ASB that deliver customer-facing digital experiences of various sorts. And so it's never been more important for us to be able to make sure that we can deliver accessibility of a high quality at scale. And so when we thought about upping our game in terms of accessibility, we also thought about the need to not only involve external partners, but to be able to teach ourselves to fish, so to speak. And that's what we're in the process of doing. So the obvious place to go for web accessibility standards is the WCAG 2.1 standard. The AA is a good challenge, and so that's 50 of the 78 guidelines in that standard. It's a step up for us because we were probably doing WCAG 2.0 single A with a bit of AA around sort of colour and contrast and bits and pieces. And certainly, I guess one of the interesting things about that is also that that's a web standard, and when you start getting into, well, what do you do about mobile native apps, things become a little bit more woolly. So we also decided we didn't know enough about it, even though we're passionate about it. So we wanted to engage an external consultant. We wanted to engage a New Zealand consultant. We really want to invest in the accessibility industry in New Zealand. And it doesn't seem to be very large, perhaps compared to the Australian or the UK equivalents at the moment. And I think that will change rapidly over time, as a number of other digital support industries have. It was logical for us when we reached out and had a look around to partner with Access Advisors, and it has been really great for us to particularly have Zoe working in our business. We've been able to say to Zoe, cover a variety of very peculiar questions, but one of those in particular was, so we see the WCAG 2.1 standard. Can you tell us what the best practice adaptation for that looks like for mobile apps? And so we're in the process of having that, clarified and written for us. We're a long way, as I said, into putting out the door a revision of the design for our mobile app for personal banking customers. And one of the next things we needed to do with Zoe was to really double down on an audit of that design and making sure that that was going to be vastly more accessible coming out of the box, and that the reusable components that's built of were going to be accessible, so that as we built new things on an ongoing basis, that we didn't invalidate that immediately, but we carried that quality forward. So that's happening at the moment. The next thing we needed to do was look at all the skill sets that needed to understand accessibility, and we've been running training for our UX and UI designers, so they can design accessibly, for our analysts, so they can create the requirements and the environment in which we can target developing accessibly in our definition of ready for our agile teams. So that we've been training our developers so that they can deliver our design intent accessibly, and we've been training our testers so they can inspect whether or not we've got that accessibility right. And I think that the other thing that we've been doing is putting in processes that allow us to make sure that that's being carried out consistently across all of those teams, and is built in where possible. Probably not surprising, but just really important for us, and certainly there's been a lot of thought leadership from Access Advisors, and we really appreciate that. I've also been immensely proud of the, team's commitment among the 200 odd people we have in ASB Digital to actually get this right. There's it's going to take an effort by everyone on an ongoing basis, but absolutely everyone there gets why we would do that. We all know people that would benefit from this, and we all want to do a better job in this area. We have a variety of other digital experiences at ASB that the Digital Tribe doesn't directly look after. Things like ATMs, digital marketing, advertising, staff digital interfaces, but we are looking at cross-pollinating what we're learning right now into all of those areas so that they can, uplift as well. The thought that I wanted to leave you with today is this. So please send through your feedback. As a customer, as a non-customer, we get around 5,000 pieces of feedback a month. We read every single one of them. We use them to make sure that we're on the right track, where we're getting praise around the things that we're doing, and to shuffle the backlogs of our agile teams to make sure that we are addressing the places where we're not getting it right. We genuinely want to be better. I was actually heartened to take some flack around the rollout of the mobile app the other day from some people around our new approach to fonts and font size. Someone saying that, or querying, whether we are actually designing with visually impaired customers in mind, because the fonts seem to be a lot larger. And the simple answer to that is yes, we are. And so it was interesting that they identified that anecdotally. So we're quite pleased. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take some questions now. I'm also happy to take some questions on the panel. Anything that anyone wants to have a chat about at this point? All right.
It's such an interesting thing when you hear about feedback. And it is something that we see, and in my role previously at the Blind Foundation, you'd see feedback coming in. And I guess what I would encourage in regards to that is always, and I'm sure the people in the room, if it's constructive, it's normally taken really well, and you try and your best to do it. If it's demanding or that, it becomes a lot harder as a human being to listen to it and to hear it. So just a bit of a reflection from me on my experience as you get that feedback in. So I'd encourage everyone, if you're using ASB's app or anyone's app and it's not working the way that you want it to work, give them that constructive feedback. Explain it to them, whether you've got a disability or not. So yeah, really great to hear Toby talking about seeking that feedback. So the next person, who I caught by surprise a little bit with asking him to talk for 5 minutes. He thought he was coming just to sit on a panel. So Jason's going to talk ad lib. So please, excuse me. Obviously, I've not communicated well enough with him that we wanted him to do a bit 5 minutes. But he's just going to talk to you a bit about where government is and what they're doing at this stage. So Jason, thank you, and thank you for being willing to ad lib.
I do have an issue with excess verbosity, so I will take advantage of that. And talk about 5 things that are going on in the government space. So I'm Principal Advisor in Accessibility for Government Information Services, which is a branch within Department of Internal Affairs, and we have responsibility for all of government ICT. And part of that includes the government web standards, the web accessibility standard being the important one of those. And they've been around since 2003, when Cabinet mandated all core government agencies basically to meet what were then called the web guidelines, which were effectively still WCAG back then. But as WCAG, as Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from W3C, as those have advanced over the years, the government web standards have kept pace. In fact, with WCAG 2.0, when that came out 10 years ago, New Zealand government was the first government in the world to formally adopt those. So WCAG 2.1 came out in June 2018, and this time around we're not the first ones to formally adopt that standard. Some other governments have done that, some other jurisdictions, but we're going ahead, and effective 1 July, the new government web standards will come into force. They're already published online right now, so you can take a look at those. They're at digital.govt.nz. So if you just could probably search that website for web standards, and you'd find them. And so the main change there is the adoption of WCAG 2.1, which adds 12 new success criteria or requirements. And these new requirements generally address what were identified as gaps in previous version of WCAG. So gaps around support for people with low vision, for people with intellectual or learning or reading disabilities, and people who are using touch interfaces or even speech recognition. So the 12 new, and they're 12 at the level AA, like Toby was mentioning, 12 new requirements that they're really focused on addressing those gaps that were identified in WCAG 2. To support the rollout of WCAG 2.1 or the new web standards, we're going to be holding a number of workshops, and those will happen probably June, July, August sort of thing. And those will be introductions to the new web standards for teams, for designers, for developers. So we'll have some targeted workshops in place. And then following those, at the moment we have a plan to have an ongoing series of what we just call clinics. And in the past we've held these sorts of events for government agencies, but vendors working on government projects as well would be welcome to attend. And these are just open clinics where you can come with your questions about web accessibility, questions about your own website, if your government agency's website. Just say, can we look at my website? Let's look at our menu. We have a problem with that. How do we fix that? And those are great. I really like them because they take little preparation on my part, but we get to address real, live, actual accessibility issues and talk about the problem, talk about the solution. And as you all know, I mean, most people are facing the same kinds of issues on their websites. So you address one of these issues, and the output from that discussion just helps everybody that's there. So that's the near or immediate future for the web standards and the support program around that. Something else that's happened in the last year or so is the Accessibility Charter. You may have heard of this. MSD, they have the Office for Disability Issues, and they have the Minister for Disability Issues, and they've really taken a strong leadership role around accessibility, and they put together this thing called the Accessibility Charter. Actually, I'll read the first few bits of it for you. It states, our organization is committed to working progressively over the next 5 years towards ensuring that all information intended for the public is accessible to everyone, and that everyone can interact with our services in a way that meets their individual needs and promotes their independence and dignity. Accessibility is a high priority for all our work. And then there's a number of bullet points that identify, in fact, in detail what this means. One of the things it means is meeting the New Zealand government web accessibility standard. And I believe every core agency has now signed this. So not only has the chief executive of the agency signed that accessibility charter, but also the head of IT and the head of comms for each agency has signed that accessibility charter. So that just adds this additional obligation on the part of each agency to, that's on top of the Human Rights Act, on top of the Bill of Rights Act, on top of the Cabinet Directive to meet the accessibility standard. We now have this express declaration by each CE that they are going to, over the next 5 years, do everything they can to improve the accessibility of their information and services. So that's a really powerful maneuver that, again, we're just following on the heels of that leadership and trying to support that charter and leverage it as much as we can. So as part of the accessibility charter, there is also going to be training associated with the charter. And so that won't be specific technical training, but it will be more general training about accessibility, about the charter, obligations, expectations on agencies, how agencies and project teams within those agencies can incorporate or plan for accessibility to help meet that the end goal of the charter. And so that training is going to happen in the latter half of this year. And also associated with the accessibility charter, it's not formally confirmed yet, but we are actively looking at holding an all-day accessibility day conference. So that again would be open to government agencies and vendors, and that would be a combination of more general introductory type sessions, as well as then maybe a couple of streams of more targeted technical sessions. But that's very exciting, and that might happen in December. But again, we're confirming the details with that. Thirdly, the business unit that I'm with, Government Information Services, we are actively developing an all-of-government design system. So a design system is a collection of discrete individual UI components, links, buttons, form inputs, every little piece that goes onto a web page, headings, lists, all of those aspects of a web page, all those features, as well as patterns. Combine, for example, a skip link pattern, skip to main content, that might be a pattern that we have in there. And then all the guidance around how to implement that and how to implement it and use it properly to deliver, again, a quality online service, website, whatever that might be. From an accessibility perspective, this is a real coup because accessibility is built in to every single one of those components and patterns. So the idea is that developers can just grab those components, grab those patterns, implement them, and not even have to worry about whether or not they're accessible. They're accessible by default. So, so is HTML accessible by default. So a lot of things are accessible by default, and then we touch them. And we break that. So, I mean, that will still be possible with the design system, but it sets you off and everyone off at the good spot where they can rely on the accessibility that's built into that. And that, the alpha for the all-of-government design system should be launched on the 27th of this month. So that should be publicly available. It's an alpha, so there doesn't have the full complement of components and patterns that we will have, but it'll give you a good indication of how that is going to work and what that's going to look like. Incidentally, we're not, every other government jurisdiction right now has a design system. And so we've taken advantage of that fact. GDS, Government Digital Services in the UK, they have a very strong design system. They also have a very large accessibility team, 10 plus people, I believe. And so they've done all the groundwork to make sure all of their components are accessible and really well tested with a broad range of individuals with disabilities of all kinds. And so it's really quite robust and reliable from that perspective. And it's open source, Creative Commons, so we basically just sucked that down and we're repurposing that and publishing it with as little change as we can, making changes to things like color and that sort of stuff to establish a new design. But the crux of it, the core of it, is basically the GDS gov.uk design system, which is great for us because, again, minimizes the work, but we can take advantage of all that great accessibility that they've already done. Another thing we're working on is a micro-credential. So this is an NZQA approved, sort of like a short, it's not a paper, it's not a full course, but it's a short program of work. We're thinking it'll probably be on the order of a 10-point NZQA kind of program. So that's about 100 hours of work. And that will be associated with the Masters of UX Design in Victoria University. So this will be a micro-credential that Vic University would offer. And we're right now exploring industry interest in that sort of thing. So if you'd like to give me your thoughts on that afterwards, feel free. But we're thinking that this is a good way to help industry really develop those sets of skills that are currently quite lacking. It also enables practitioners in the industry to attain a certain certification or a badge or a certain degree of recognized knowledge and skill in that space, which then enables, for example, government agencies to happily hire those individuals or hire those firms where those individuals have that certification, and we can rely on their knowledge in accessibility because it's been vetted through this Vic University micro-credential. So that is in the development stage right now. Don't know when that's going to come out, but that's something we're actively developing and really excited about. So not only will participants in the Masters of UX and Design program be exposed to this accessibility component, which is great, because typically in almost all of these programs around the world universities, accessibility is just a blip, if it's even discussed. So having a formal component as part of this master's program for UXers who end up working in our firms and our government agencies in Wellington is really great. So that's something we're looking forward to. And so those are the four main interesting developments. Fifthly, I just wanted to mention that this evening there is the Wellington Web Accessibility Meetup is having a session at Xero's offices. If you check the meetup site, you can find it. I think it starts at 6 or 6:30. And I know Jazz, who is the lead on the all-of-government design system, will be talking in more detail about the design system at the new Wellington Web Accessibility Meetup that is rekindling itself, so to speak, this evening at Xero's offices. So, and that's it for me. Good?
Yep, great. Not bad for something that was short notice, so could always rely on Jason to wow the audience, shall we say. Next up, and our final speaker before we get to just a panel discussion, is Mary Fisher. Now, Mary, although she retired last year from swimming, is a multi-medal winning, gold medal winning Paralympian in swimming. So, and that's no small feat. She's also a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Did I get that right, Mary? And was inducted into that as well. What I've asked Mary to do is actually to come and have a discussion with you about her lived experience, the challenges that she might face, the things that sometimes might take a little bit longer, shall we say, or not be possible at all. So that, to us, I thought it would be a good way of closing it out, winding it out, and actually just talking and giving an experience of why this is important, the who and the why. So Mary, if I can guide you over here. Now I'm going to guide you onto this side to... Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a lead on this side. The floor's yours.
Cheers. Kia ora tātou, mō te tono ki te kōrero. Thanks very much, Phil, for the lovely introduction and yeah, for inviting me to share a bit about my experiences today. So it's a really good thing to be here and for everyone to be thinking and talking and discussing together about this, because we know that, sorry, I came in slightly late from a flight from Auckland, but if it wasn't mentioned before, 24% of Kiwis identify as having a disability, and among Māori that's 33%, 1 in 3. So it's not just for those users of your organisation or your department that you're helping their family and friends who often get tasked with doing all the digital stuff if it's too hard, or the person needing adaptive software hasn't had the training on that because there's a lack of people with that knowledge. So there's all these different facets of how using these guidelines that have already been talked about can really help a whole group of people, not just the person with a disability or a learning difference or some other kind of condition that means they use the internet in a different way. So a little bit about myself. I was born with a genetic condition called aniridia, which means no iris. So I don't have the coloured part of your eye that contracts and expands to deal with whatever lighting situation you have. But it also causes underdevelopment of other parts of your eye. And for me, that meant I grew up with about 10% of normal sight. So my eye doesn't block out any light, and I could only see things that are really close, and I couldn't see much detail. So when I was in primary school and computer technology was in the very beginnings of being taught to students, yeah, I was okay as long as the screen was close enough. I could kind of navigate. I wasn't as fast at scanning as my peers, but because I had grown up with limited sight, I didn't really know any different. And in terms of talking about colour contrast or those kind of things, I have a very vivid memory of being in my first couple of weeks at school and learning in terms of literacy. Everyone was sitting on the mat, and there was a big easel with one of those A2 papers or something that you can flip over the easel, and the teacher was drawing a big letter, and everyone on the mat was like shouting out the letter, but I could see the teacher's arm moving, but I couldn't see anything on the paper. It just looked like a blank piece of paper, even though she'd moved her arm, and everyone else was yelling out a letter and seemingly getting it right, and I was very confused because the paper still looked blank to me. And so, being my 5-year-old self that wasn't self-conscious yet and not worrying about what other kids thought of me, I kind of put up my hand and said, I don't see any letters. How does everyone see them? I'm not seeing any, and not understanding that everyone else had better sight than me. And they didn't really miss a beat. She just swapped out her pencil for vivid, and suddenly the letters were there for me, which was a really cool moment. And I, only recently thinking back over my primary experiences, it was just something totally simple that she did, that she could have, if she knew that would have made a difference to me, she could have started out and I wouldn't have felt like, oh, what's everyone, how are they knowing what's happening? And I feel completely left out. And I had the confidence at that stage, whereas as a teenager, I would have never have tried to say, oh, how do I change that? So, using this as a metaphor for something more digital, this is something that a teacher could have done straight away if she knew what was going to work for me. And all of us, if we are in a coding kind of job or working with specific groups of customers, if you know what people need, and that's why there's great international standards out there, that you can start off with that and everyone has the same chance to engage and learn and connect with each other. And I think a lot of, especially people with disabilities, often you feel, oh, I'm causing extra work for someone if they're having to implement something that's, going to make things accessible for me. But it is going to help everyone having more accessible standards implemented. And so that was kind of my experience throughout primary school, of kind of just making adaptations, and it worked well. And when I was in high school, my sight got worse and I had to learn to read Braille and to use a cane, and a lot of things, it felt like I was kind of having to go back to scratch around the time when my peers were 15 and getting their driver's license and going partying and all these things, which felt so far away when I was learning to cross the street again. But with adaptive technology, I could learn to use the screen reader program JAWS, and with kind of inbuilt features like the voiceover on my phone, I can listen to this little voice, and it's good because quite a lot of people don't use that and can't understand it, even if yes, it is English. When my friends say, is that English? But yeah, there are things where there's universal accessibility features inbuilt that you can turn on and off depending what you need. Those are great. But if they're not there, it's furthering the divide, which for people who it's going to take me longer to get somewhere, it's going to cost more for transport sometimes. All those little things in life, it'd be really great if being online was as easy as anyone else in terms of my experience. So yeah, currently I use internet banking. I did a degree through Massey as a kind of part-time, nearly all papers as distance student when I was swimming and being underwater a lot. It's great to have that kind of distance study option. And to my parents' delight, I'm finally going to the ceremony at the end of the month after 2.5 years after my last paper finished. But yeah, I mean, even though I didn't have the typical experience of going to lectures and living in a hall, yeah, I was in this very small clique of people who were going round in circles in a 26-degree pool. I had this experience of being able to engage with university and getting around some of the websites and getting around some of the textbooks and especially old academic documents and trying to find page numbers to cite stuff and PDFs that say image 2.6 instead of, like a 26-page document. But technology is getting a lot better, and I do feel hopeful within my experiences as someone with low vision and blindness, and within my friends' experiences too. So there's really good guidelines out there. Being able to sort through information on a page. So yes, all the things people have said already, having headings so you can actually find what's, and not have to read everything, and kind of being able to do scanning like a sighted person would. But yeah, it also not just making text bigger to indicate a heading, putting it in a heading, and having form fields and buttons that say what is there. And it is really great to be able to have a picture and understand what is mostly happening in a picture when there's a caption or alt text. It totally opens up a new world to me and other people with vision impairment, and some people who are neurodiverse and might not be able to gain the same things from a picture as someone who's neurotypical. So it does not have to be 1,000 words, to explain a picture, but I find it really good to, what are the main components of this? What emotion would you feel if you're a sighted person looking at it? Those are the things that I tell people, but there's really good guidelines around all of that. I think the other big things are having easy read documents when there's, especially for government processes and health information, having an easy read document for people with learning differences is really useful, and kind of bright, shiny, flashing graphics. It's good to have maybe if that is part of what your organisation does, having a plain text version can definitely help a lot of people. So I think those are the main things that I've encountered in terms of mine and my friends who use adaptive technology or have disabilities. Our experiences. But yeah, making a simple change from a pencil to a vivid can help so many people, and realising that disability does affect a core population, but it also are all those temporary things. So when we're talking about physical accessibility, if you break your leg and you're on crutches, it's really great to have not too many random cracks in the footpath. And similar for digital access, if you have laser treatment and need to use different types of software for a while, there are all these different types of temporary ways where having a fully accessible internet will help as well. So thanks for having me along. It's really great to include people with lived experience, and co-design is so important. So, kia ora.
Right. So, thank you, Mary. It is always great to actually hear the personal experiences and those life experiences. It helps bring it all into perspective and why we're here doing this. I was also interested to hear Mary talking about documents, and I know there's a bit of a push at the moment for EPUB 3, and considering how you might present your documents, if you're presenting them on the web or if you're presenting them in any which way, and making sure that you do so accessibly. So the Access for All campaign mentioned to me before I even came, oh, you're doing something for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Could you mention EPUB 3? So she gave me the perfect segue to get in there and just to do it. What I would encourage you to do is actually just head off and do a bit more reading about it and understand why it's so good. It just helps with the navigation. It's all the WCAG stuff, but for documents. That's probably the easiest way of explaining it. And it's worth considering, and there are governments around the world who are looking at using it as their default publishing methodology for documents. In saying that, you hear constantly that PDFs are inaccessible. No, badly formed PDFs are inaccessible. If you scan it and it's just an image, then it just can't be seen and it's not going to work. But if it's formed well, it's not so bad. There are some limitations around iOS, and I'm looking at Jason who schooled me on this over the years. There are some limitations in the way that some systems handle it, but the actual PDF can be accessible. So what I'd like to...
If you're on Windows.
If you're on Windows, is it?
If you're not using Windows,
yeah,
then no.
Yep. So what I'd like to do is invite the 4 panelists up, and maybe just to sit on the chairs at the front here. And now it's your chance. It's your turn to actually ask some questions. We don't have a microphone, so if they're a bit quiet, they might have to get up to the lectern to talk to you. But we'll do our best to go from there. So, from what you've heard today, or from your experiences, does anyone want to start us off? Oh. I'll go. You're up right down the back first. So, yeah.
Peter was saying before about the DIAs and feeding accessibility into the AAG system. What's your thoughts on the long-term goal? Not just going from CUSA to ESD, and for the different government departments picking up the system. So as much as it comes down to finance, there's always these elements that are in place that different departments don't quite get there. So how do you see there being a big uptake from different government departments to use the design system?
Yeah, we're hoping. All the feedback so far has been really, really positive. The thing about the design system is that by default, the default design or theme that it comes with is very simple, but it's themable, right? So it should be flexible enough to accommodate whatever design the designers or that project has come up with. Long term, it's a piece of the larger puzzle, right? So we need things like the accessibility charter to help enforce the requirement to deliver accessibility. And one of the easiest ways to do that is going to be to use the design system. So we're hoping that kind of alignment will really help promote use and uptake of the design system. But we're not sure at this point. I mean, it makes sense. Compared with other governments, New Zealand is interesting in that there's no common look and feel to government websites. They all can look, and in fact, agencies tend to prefer that their website looks unlike any other government website, or works unlike any other government website, which means for users, we have to learn how to use anew every single government website, which is in itself a massive usability problem. And so the design system, again, will help that make websites all work more so the same way, or at least components, individual UI components and patterns will be repeated across government websites. So that will help as well. One thing, you just made me remember one thing I neglected to mention about the accessibility charter, and again, this is another piece of the puzzle. MSD will be auditing agencies on how well they are meeting their obligations under the accessibility charter. So again, to the degree that using the design system is going to help you deliver on your obligations under the accessibility charter, that's just only going to help the uptake of the design system, I think.
Okay. Next, yep.
This might be a question for Toby. I don't know. You say that your organisation has had a really wide uptake of, or like they're all very enthusiastic about increasing your accessibility standards and things. How do you encourage staff members who might be a little bit, they find it a bit difficult to follow those guidelines? So things like designers who might know that their colour contrast is wrong, and you point it out, but they still, they don't feel the drive to want to actually follow those guidelines. How do you get like everyone to be on board with that? Like, answerable, but,
Yeah. So let's look at it a couple of different ways. So one is that when we've set this new standard internally, it's a standard non-functional requirement for us. So that means that it's kind of like performance. You know, if we want sub 3-second page loads, we also want WCAG 2.1 AA. These things sit side by side on a list of things that we are going to be achieving. You know, so it's not necessarily something that we're making optional per se. I think that the other thing is that the design team in ASB Digital is an incredible bunch of people that, you know, genuinely care about the community, and there isn't really any resistance there. I could sort of answer your question hypothetically, but I'd rather reflect on a conversation that we were having the other day. We have a weekly forum called Design Clinic, where we have the whole design team there and we're kicking around a problem, and we let anyone else that wants to come and do co-design with us. And one of the UX guys was leading a conversation about how we could make our dynamic graphing accessible, which is something we've looked around and we just haven't seen anyone else doing a lot, and maybe that's just because we haven't looked in the right places and we're about to reinvent the wheel, but hopefully it's actually something that's a bit new and different. And when you look at making you know, dynamic graphing of someone's finances accessible, it turns out that if you want to systematically describe what's going on in a graph, and you want to use the title of the graph and the axes labels and the scales and everything that's going on there, it just makes a better graph for, you know, everyone when you actually you know, get that right. In much the same way that, you know, we do this as well, but we don't, you know, a lot of our sites are logged in. They don't have that external SEO, you know, compulsion to them, but search engine optimization is certainly something that benefits a lot when you get your accessibility right, because you know, crawlers like Google often act just like large screen readers. You know, so there's a lot of different motivations to get this stuff right, and there's a real opportunity to spark people's intellectual curiosity and problem solving, if that's one way to sort of motivate them into the space as well. Is that okay?
Yeah. I have another question.
Go for it.
Jason, do you know if the government will ever, in the near future, introduce anything that has a legal precedent, so that where you could get penalised if you actually fail?
Right. Well, so, yeah, there's no regulatory framework in place right now around that, and I don't expect there will be unless we have new legislation in place. And so I know that the Access Alliance, which is a number of disabled persons organizations in New Zealand, have managed to convince the minister to establish a committee to investigate the feasibility of an Accessibility for New Zealanders Act. And that would be explicit accessibility legislation, and modeled on the accessibility legislation that exists in some other countries. The province of Ontario in Canada has some very strong accessibility legislation with fines and that sort of thing, and some kind, so penalties. And so if we end up with an Accessibility for New Zealanders Act, there's a possibility for some sort of associated regulatory framework there that would result in that kind of thing. Currently, though, I mean, we have the Human Rights Act, so someone could make human rights complaints about any website, public or private. You know, it's not just the government. If you discriminate in the delivery of your service on the basis of a disability, along with all the other conditions of discrimination, it's against the law. So there can be consequences there, but there's a significant barrier to entry, so to speak. You have to file the complaint and then maintain. You have to be tenacious and go through all the steps there. And in fact, we don't, with our particular human rights system, it's the same in most Westminster governments. Complaints that are made to the Human Rights Commission are not made public unless they're not solved between the parties, and most of them are solved between the parties, and so we just never hear about complaints that have been made about private sector websites or government websites. We don't know about those. But there is currently, theoretically, there are consequences under the Human Rights Act for not doing that, but we don't have any express, clear penalty system or consequence system.
I can speak personally to the fact that I've supported a number of complaints through the Human Rights Act that relate or are closely related to this issue. So I've had members of the Blind Foundation phone me up, speak to me and say, what do I do, where do I go? And I can tell you that there are financial payouts that happen here in New Zealand. We just never find out about them because what happens is it goes to mediation and then it gets resolved, sometimes with a financial payout, but with a confidentiality clause attached to it as well. And so I can't go into any details of them. I can't tell you what's going on, but I know that they happen. And I was just speaking with somebody who was complaining about a website and was talking about taking a human rights case. He phoned me up for some initial guidance, and that was last week. So they do happen. It's just we can't sit there and shout for them. In fact, if the confidentiality couldn't occur, accessibility would have been forward on the agenda 10, 15, 20 years ago, because we don't in New Zealand have the Coles-Myer or the Sydney Olympics in Australia cases where the organisations fought them all the way through to the equivalence of our Human Rights Tribunal. They lost, they got a major judgment against them. All of a sudden there's a public knowledge of the requirements and away it goes. And so Australia, whilst they've still got plenty of problems and plenty of things to think about, they moved forward at a slightly faster rate. And I can say, sorry Toby, but the banking industry, I know that over there the banking industry moved faster than what the banking industry has here. So that I can talk to personally and say it does happen. Can't give you any details, but other than assuring you that human rights cases do happen and they do get resolved. So, do we have more questions from the floor? Yep, down the back there.
I'm quite new to this area, and I hear examples all the time of really bad websites, but apart from GDS, I don't hear a lot about really good examples. Do you have any other?
So the question is about examples of websites that are doing it well. And I know straight away we go to the UK government because they are real thought leaders and other things. But really this might be someone for Zoe and Jason to talk about any other sites that they can think of that really champion the concept.
Or Mary as a user.
Oh, Mary as a user, yeah, sorry.
I'd probably say the same thing because the UK has done so much. The other thing I should say is I'm not a super techie person, but yeah, I guess
Websites where you had to accomplish a task but didn't face that many barriers that you felt you had to work around.
And I think maybe my threshold is quite low for sometimes getting other people to do stuff. So especially booking websites of flights or tickets or all those things I find really difficult, and I often say, can I just transfer you if you buy or everyone's tickets or something? But for general information, New Zealand news sites are getting better, and especially apps. So on I use an iPhone, so on there, they're okay. But yeah, personally, I think accessibility legislation in New Zealand that covered digital and physical access in education and employment, having something overarching would be really positive.
I think the difficulty as well in kind of pointing people to a great example of a website is that they change.
And people have different needs.
Yeah.
Websites where you can alter the font and colour contrast are good.
Okay.
I was going to say, I mean, they're not perfect at all, and they have some WCAG failures and some other accessibility issues. But the gov.nz site is a reasonable example. I would venture that. Well, I wouldn't say this about the alpha, but when the all of government design system website is out of beta and finalized, I would hope, not wood, fingers crossed, that it would be a very good example of a compliant, WCAG compliant website.
I should
At the
also
least.
I just mentioned, like, if you are wanting feedback in a kind of survey way, like SurveyMonkey is accessible. That's definitely go for that as a first option if you're wanting an accessible kind of feedback that is not just email back us a few sentences if you want something more detailed.
That's great.
Did you hear that down the back? Just making sure that it. Great.
Sorry, protect.
Yep. Sorry.
I've got a slightly related question. My name's Susie Linton. I'm from the Office for Disability Issues. Someone appeared at my desk a while back and with 7 CDs of audio files. Turned out it was in DAISY format, and the expectation was I was going to present this on the website. It's now about a month later and I'm still wondering how I do that. Are there any examples of a way that can be done? Because at the moment the best solution I've been able to find is to point them back at the Blind Foundation who created the translation and get them to get the DAISY format files from them.
Okay. I can probably help with this one. I used to run the accessible format service at the Blind Foundation, and including DAISY files. The answer to it is, we could make them an EPUB. We could actually convert them to an EPUB because EPUB handles audio as well, but that's cheating the system a little bit. There are MP3 files buried in that.
Yep, I've managed to get it converted into MP3.
Yep.
It's too big to host. I can get my developers to host it on the website, but it's too big for me to be able to upload in-house, so that's probably a problem for people who are needing to download it as well.
Yeah, I think what we should do is take this conversation and, because what I'll do is I'll take you back and introduce you, as you say, the Blind Foundation created it. We work out of the same office still, so I can help facilitate that conversation to get you the best solution rather than...
Great, thank you.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, I'm Nick from Everybody Calls. Here we're an arts organisation and don't really do web stuff. But I guess, my question was about user profiles, or like computer says no seem to be the start of the kind of talk of like putting it through a survey kind of thing and saying, yes, that works, no, that doesn't work. But wondering within that charter if there is like user profiles or kind of different character and like how you bring a human into the conversation. And I guess that's done slightly with co-design, but how you cost that and what that relationship looks like when you're building the website. Sorry.
No.
I'm wondering if I've understood correctly. The New Zealand government, in particular DIA, as part of the initial work on gov.nz, which 6-7 years ago now, developed a bunch of personas, and we have recently redone all of those. And so is that the sort of thing you're talking about? I mean, so if, as part of the design process, we would have personas, which are abstracted mindsets, and those represent, they're designed to represent, and we have, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 of them, you know, Karen? But they represent a broad spectrum of the New Zealand populace, right? And so it includes all sorts of the minority characteristics, so including disability and that sort of thing. We are also, when we test, we're in discussion right now to establish a pool of testers with disabilities. So when we are doing user research, we're going to make sure that we involve the group of people that we involve as testers, as representatives of the public, so to speak, include disabled people. Does that answer your question?
If you wanted costing on having
costing
on testers, so just coming around to the costing on testers, come and talk to us. What we did was actually generate a panel of people with disabilities who can be involved and test your products from their perspective with their technology in their environment. So without going into broad details, roughly you're sitting around $100 an hour per tester when you want that feedback. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And is the personas, like, is that a public, or is that?
They will be public.
Yeah.
And I think the original ones are public. But if you want to hit me up afterwards, I can follow up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, down the back here.
Yeah, hi. One of the original slides that Zoe brought up around the design heuristics had sort of a ranking system for conforming to the criteria. With the stuff I've been working on with the WCAG stuff over the years, it's pass or fail. And that's always been interpretive. On some of them, it's clearly interpretive anyway. So I'm just interested, those sorts of ranking or sort of outline, etc., would be, that's a more of a, it's an easier way to sort of judge some of the performance criteria, I feel from my point of view as well.
Yeah, so the idea behind that with DQ producing those was just an easier way for designers to rate how accessible certain parts or certain requirements were. So the ranking, that was just an example of what DQ proposed.
Yeah.
But the recommendation was for each organisation to choose their own ranking scale. And basically at the end what it does is it gives you a good indication of which statement is really needs attention based on that ranking system. Yeah, it was just a very a lot easier for designers to address WCAG standards, but without having to get involved in all of the actual documentation of WCAG, which can be, like you said, quite difficult to, one, understand, and two, to interpret from a designer's point of view.
Yeah, just applying that to the more detailed requirements of pass-fail, that lends itself a bit more to the sort of investigation as opposed to that sort of black and white, because it's that interpretive sort of where you're trying to go to. And if that could follow down to sort of these government or the previous self-assessments or ones coming up, I think that might be a beneficial aid for people, because the pass or fail can be quite polarizing.
Well, it also doesn't help you prioritize.
Correct.
To work, right? And not every accessibility failure has the same impact. Some are full-on barriers, and some are just going to add some degree of hindrance. Yeah. And so prioritizing that is the trick. Yeah, and some of that's taken care of by the levels in WCAG. So level A is theoretically a level A failure is a greater barrier than a level AA failure. But even there, there's all sorts of debate within the accessibility community of whether level AA item should have been a level A, and that sort of discussed. So it's really my recommendation is always that, with the help of somebody who knows something about accessibility, work with the team to prioritize those issues that are raised, and then they can get prioritizing the backlog that way and addressed in a practical, pragmatic fashion.
Just to add, and you know, every time we interact with Zoe, we learn something. But one of the first things that Zoe showed us was actually a breakdown of which parts of WCAG 2.1 applied most to different roles within the process for actually delivering compliant experiences. And so we found that really beneficial to actually be able to take the designers or the testers or the developers or the analysts and actually be able to focus them more on certain areas of the requirements that they could influence outcomes in most. So I know that that's not talking about after you've tested and how you resolve that, but maybe on the way to having less to resolve. Excuse me.
Okay.
And just incidentally, that information about role-specific WCAG, it's available freely. You know, it's out there on the web, so if you check out W3C's documentation on that, role-based WCAG, then you can find that information for yourself. I think currently it's only up to WCAG 2.0, but I just used the new criteria and just added that myself. But yeah, but it gives you a good indication of which roles are responsible for which requirements, so you can kind of compartmentalize your workload between your teams.
There's no doubt that WCAG, when you first get introduced to it, seems like a daunting task. And I think Toby's nodding his head here, but it is about breaking it up and biting off what you can chew and working in a really positive and forward process. Okay, any other questions? Yep.
Jason, the idea of the conference later this year seemed like a really positive development. I'm just wondering if at this stage there's scope to kind of influence the program for it, and I wondered if there was an opportunity to have workshops on particularly gnarly issues that government agencies face us, where we would all benefit from being able to share ideas. And the two examples that spring to mind that are of most interest to us here at the Treasury are the dynamic charting issue and accessibility of dynamic charts that Toby raised, because we want to do a lot more of that with that content across all of our websites for the budget in particular.
Right.
Yep. And secondly, we have a lot of expertise around complex markup of tables, particularly financial statements. We probably do the best job of anybody across the government at that, but we have our own challenges still, and would like to get into a position where we're able to share our expertise and the tools that we use wider across government. So is that the kind of thing that you guys envisage for the conference?
It could well be.
Yeah.
And if not part of the conference, as part of an ongoing engagement with the community, because that sort of sharing and reusing of those approaches makes sense. And you're right. In discussion on and off with stats as well, about, because data visualization is just so huge now, and how do you deliver statistical information or insights to the public in a meaningful way where the general public can parse that information, let alone the accessibility considerations. But certainly those are key as well. So I mean, that's all part of the same picture, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a Adobe Worldwide Conference recently where I was really excited to see a beta of their application of their AI technology, which they call sort of universally Sensei. And one of the applications of it was in their digital analytics product, where they were using it to interrogate and automatically caption graphs for analysts. So the analysts just needed to check and edit the captions, natural language translation, including some quite deep analysis of what the graphs were potentially showing. Now, I mean, obviously I didn't actually see it working live. I saw a demo of it, and you know the demos can be
magic demo.
Of various things. But as much as we may be trying to solve it ourselves at the moment, it would be nice to think that that would be a great application of AI and natural language processing at some point. Yeah.
It's very doable, and for me it is super useful to have a uniform way of describing dynamic diagrams and graphs. There's Jonathan Godfrey, who's a stats professor at Massey and Palmy, and he's blind, and so he uses R all the time and teaches students. And yeah, there's a little someone in Ireland, I think, someone in the States, and him. Is it right?
It's in Ireland, yeah.
Yeah, but you know that there's really good things going on, and it's totally possible.
Yeah. 2 of our applications use R.
Yeah.
Technology.
Okay. No. Oh yeah. More.
Just real quick, is there a mailing list that we can find out about the conferences and things like government announcements, or is it just the website? Or?
Digital.gov.nz has a blog on it, and these things will be announced in that blog. And if you're a government employee, you could ask, and Yammer is allowed in your agency. There's the New Zealand Government Web Community Yammer group, and things are often announced there or discussed there as well. So, and it's just general web digital delivery. So, and it can be quite good as well. So, if you're not on there and you can get on there, then do it.
Okay. More questions? Some good discussion going on, so I'm always open to a bit more. Or go on then. Go on. Yep.
I was wondering, do you guys kind of keep an eye on the HTML standards as well and changes that are happening there? Like, I was really disappointed with HTML5 and they sort of dropped support for the summary attribute on tables.
Why?
Yeah, because we use it. And because they describe the structure of tables.
Yeah, but it's hidden.
Yeah, I know, but it's
so no sighted users get that.
I'm not really so much worried about the sighted users. That was the unsighted
and then the argument, well, that was the right.
Yeah.
All right. Really? So I mean, there's more people with cognitive and intellectual and learning disabilities than there are with, not that we're playing a numbers game, but that's interesting. And I get that. You want to. The issue of the summary attribute was that, first of all, it's hidden metadata about the structure of the table.
That's what we use it for.
Yeah. And if the table is simple, then it doesn't need a summary attribute.
What if it's not?
But if it's not simple, then you should. Then the argument is you should revisit how you develop and design the tables.
But we can't, because they're all required by statute. They're structured in a particular way. So you're affecting the integrity of the information if you restructure it.
Right.
Yeah. That's not an answer.
No, I don't.
We tried there once.
No, it is an answer. It's just it's going to come out. It's not when it's going to fly for you. I know. IRD has similar issues, so there's nothing stopping you from providing the information that you would normally put in a summary attribute in visible text associated with the table using, for example, ARIA described by, and thereby provide that information to absolutely everyone.
Sure.
So everyone can understand.
Yeah. But is there a risk that the summary attribute will still kind of creep back into support?
No.
No, there's no risk of that.
No risk of that happening. No. No chance. No, and primarily the reason is because it's hidden metadata.
Yeah.
And so it reduces, it increases the accessibility for a small group, but reduces the accessibility for a much larger group.
Risk there because if it's hidden, people can't QA it and correct it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And right, so the table changes, but the summary attribute doesn't, and now it describes a different table.
Yeah. It's like,
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Nick?
Yep, thanks. I just wanted to ask a quick question to both Jason and Toby around the willingness to engage in co-design with the disability community disabled people. Because I think clearly there's going to be an industry developing around professional advice around accessibility. I think it's really a great thing because technical advice really supports the development of accessible products and services. But what I wanted to ask you was, what is the willingness to engage in co-design with disabled people? Because I mean, Mary's given us a really good example here of the best person to communicate the understanding around experience of disability, other people with lived experience themselves. So I just wanted to ask you, what is the appetite to engage directly alongside the professional advice?
That's great. I was going to say, please, Toby.
Huge. And I think we love talking to customers. I mean, obviously, I mentioned feedback before. I should correct myself and say we love talking to people in New Zealand and not just customers. So, but I think specifically we are putting new focus, within the organisation at the moment around potentially vulnerable customers. With about 15 different definitions of potential vulnerability, including things like financial bullying, which is another big issue for older customers, for example, potentially. And we really want to engage with people, that represent, those groups, and make sure that we're getting things right. We've never looked at some of that stuff before, so it's going to be it's not like accessibility where we have had some activity around that. Some of that stuff is going to be a first for us, and we are exploring ways, what the best ways are to actually engage, with people that best help us to be empathetic, to those different types of people. So, I know that sounds a bit like a political speech, and there's no specifics in that. We have set up a customer panel last year of around 12,000 ASB customers that we want to really draw from, to be able to talk to customers directly. We've always done it using ad hoc recruitment prior to that, rather than having a pre-recruited panel. I'm not sure we have all of the various types of people within that panel well represented at this point in time, but we're refining it. It's a work in progress. So that's one of the examples of what we are actually doing to make it easier and faster for us to be able to get real people involved.
Sure.
What do you mean by co-design?
Well, I'll ask you that question back. What do you understand by co-design?
Yeah, co-design, I think, like co-development or pair programming, where you have co-design would be a number of designers designing something together. But what I'm thinking you're talking about is sort of, again, including users as part of the design process. And I think, the willingness for that, alongside what Toby said, is high. I'm getting more and more requests, again, like I was mentioning earlier, for people with disabilities who can serve as testers. And that's testing mock-ups, testing wireframes, testing alpha versions of websites, and that sort of thing. And so that's increasing. I guess it is co-design in a sense, absolutely, because you're just including the people for whom you're designing in the process, right? And historically, I mean, in the past 10 years, that's been the default approach, but typically has not included people with disabilities. Right? So that is changing, and my impression is that the willingness is high for that, based on the increase in the numbers of people asking me for that kind of support.
Thank you.
All right, well, we might finish it there. It's actually really great to finish it on making sure that we get the real lived experience rolled into what we're doing, and to remember that at all facets. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Mary, Zoe, Jason and Toby for what they've done today. And also to InternetNZ, who have yet again kindly donated a location for this to take place, and the team here have always been willing to step up and help out with this conversation. So a big thank you to them as well. So as we're finishing, there is some tea and coffee and some snacks. I think there's some muffins and some fruit and some other things out there. There's gluten-free option as well. So if anyone wants to stay around and have a bit of a chat and network, please do. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you.